Restream that takes this Zoom channel and goes to LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube.
Wow.
And here we go. So I now believe we are live. It always takes a second, and I wish I was just better at this of knowing for sure. But we are going to roll with it here. And happy Wednesday, everyone. It looks like we are just about rolling live here in a second, seeing us live. So wonderful. We are back, Wildfire Wednesday. We took a little break last week while I was traveling at the AFAC show, and the weeks prior, we were at the FRI show and did pretty much stream the whole time. So it was this kind of a wildfire week, which is pretty great. But excited to be alongside a group of distinguished panelists talking about wildfire and policy, and excited to dive in further today. So I'm going to be your sous chef. If you've got comments, questions, fire up the LinkedIn, fire up the Facebook, fire up YouTube, wherever you're listening. This is for you to ask questions and get the most out of it. So I'm going to pass it to Eric Litzenberg, who's going to be the head moderator today, and all the speakers will introduce themselves. And thanks again for being here, and excited for a great show today.
Great, Kevin. Thank you. Appreciate it, man. I'm just going to say briefly, you'd be hard pressed to find people who could make wildfire policy exciting. We've got them on the call today. We've got the people who can do that, which is really pretty darn cool. For those who listen regularly, you know me. For those who don't, Eric Litzenberg came out of Santa Fe, New Mexico. I was a local fire, and now I'm IFC's Senior Wildland Fire Advisor. That's my intro. That's all we need. I'm going to go straight to our guests, and I'm sure this is going to make Mike Zupko very comfortable because in elementary school, you know, you go by alphabet. We're going to go by alphabet, by last name. So, Mike, you have a ton of time, like you did when you were 2 years old and above, to get ready for yours. And I'm going to start with Katie Lighthall. Why don't you introduce yourself? Give us a few minutes on where you come from.
Thanks, Chief. Katie Lighthall. I live in Central Oregon. For a little while longer, managed the western region of the Wildland Fire Leadership Council.
Excellent. Good to have you on board here, Katie.
Thank you.
And Bob Roper. L is before R is next.
Okay, well, I live in that large state on the West Coast, not quite to Hawaii, but it will go unnamed. I act as the wildfire policy advisor for the Western Fire Chiefs Association, which is the 10 Western states in the U.S.
You guys are being so brief and intros. When we say brief, we're finally having people follow our instructions, Kevin.
Oh, yeah, 2/3 of the way there.
Like 45 seconds is good.
2/3 of the way. Mike Zupko, Z, we're to you, man.
It's hard following the country of California, but Bob, I'll say it since you won't. Mike Zupko, most recently the executive director of the Wildland Fire Leadership Council. Transitioning out of that, we'll probably talk a little bit about the state of play there during this call. Reside close to the holy city of Athens, Georgia. Go Dogs! It's football season. We can talk football if we want to. Kevin, I hope that's on the schedule.
Go Badgers.
We'll tie it into wildfire policy somehow. I don't know. I did it in my graduation speech. So, yeah, glad to be here. Glad to talk about a lot going on, both in Congress and in the policy space, through governments up and down, from the federal all the way down to the local level. A lot going on, a lot to learn, a lot of opportunity, a lot of challenges.
Nice. Well, Mike, stay in the hot seat for a second here, because you mentioned the Wildland Fire Leadership Council, or WFLIC. Why don't you describe to us what WFLIC is and what it does?
Sure. So WFLIC's been around since 2002. It stems somewhat out of the National Fire Plan, not directly, but probably because of, and we can look back at some of the history of some of the policies through the years if we want to, but not the National Fire Plan back in 2000 was pretty seminal. Some new funding came with it, some new direction to the Forest Service and USDA and the DOI bureaus. And so WFLIC stemmed out of that, saying, hey, this isn't just a federal challenge that we have with wildfire. This is an everyone challenge. So we need levels of government, not just the federal government, at the table. So early on, when WFLIC started, like I said, 2003, States, locals, tribes were at the table, not as many as there are currently through each iteration of the MOU that the secretaries of Ag and Interior and then other secretaries have signed through the years. We now have 24 members at the WFLC table. So you have 16 federal members representing Department of Agriculture within the Forest Service, within Department of Interior, within the Policy Management and Budget Assistant Secretariat, as well as the 4 bureaus. Leadership, you've got Department of Homeland Security through FEMA and the U.S. Fire Administrator. You've got Department of Defense through both their energy installations and environment side, as well as their side that represents the troops on the ground. And most recently, even last year, we added leadership in Environmental Protection Agency, as well as Center for Disease Control and Prevention, really focusing on that public health side of things. So that's the federal side of the family. On the non-federal side, you have governors, you have state foresters, you have state emergency managers, you have county officials, city officials, tribal nations represented, and fire chiefs represented. I didn't count on my fingers, but that should add up to 8 non-federal members. And the intent behind WFLC really is to look at that intersection and how do you consistently and effectively implement current, and I say current, wildland fire policy. So WFLC has never been in the space of saying Congress, we need a bunch of new laws. It was in the space of saying, here's the laws, here's the regulations, here's the policies that we have on the books, and here's how we're going to do a better job of implementing that together. Now, that said, when you do that, and Chief Roper sat on WFLC for more than a handful of years, as did Eric, you start to realize there's gaps or challenges or conflicts within that legislation. So how that plays out through especially the non-federal members, I think, is an important piece of it too, that, still there's more opportunity there to help draw the dotted lines a little more direct. But working through that, federal, state, tribal, and local partnership, I think has been key to moving a lot of things forward and or identifying a lot of challenges.
Mike, I could see everybody getting excited over UGA jokes when you were saying counting on your fingers, but luckily nothing came up till now, so we'll stop there. I'm interested in hearing both Katie and Bob's perspective on WFLC, but starting with you, one last follow-up, Mike. So Wildland Fire Leadership Council, is it an office? Is it an actual space? Or is it a space where theory can happen, where leadership can, what is it?
A little bit of both. So like I mentioned, about every 5 years, the secretaries will sign an MOU, which continues the council. It was signed last year, the end of last year, for an additional 5 years. The way it's operated for the past 10 years has been with contracted staff. So Katie and I were both contracted staff. I worked at the national level. Katie was one of the 3 regional coordinators. It's not an office per se, but because it's the leadership of every agency and organization and department that has a stake in wildfire, at least within the government circles, in theory, each of the components within those agencies, bureaus, departments, et cetera, states, have a seat at the table. So it's not an office that can send specific direction to any one agency or organization. It's a collaborative framework that allows folks to say, yes, this is the right thing. For example, the nomenclature around fire year that had been being used a little bit in some circles, but at the WFLC table, the leadership said, hey, this is something that we need to get around. We need to message to Congress. We need to message to funders and say, this is no longer a fire season we're dealing with. This is the 12 months of the year. Either there's fires in some geography and or there's something we need to be doing about fires during that time. So fire year is an example of what came out of that. How that trickled down, for example, is DOI 5 or 6 years ago really rallied around that and started changing how they projected or how they put forward their budget package to Congress. So that's just kind of one example of how things play out. But not necessarily it's not an office per se, but it has the leadership, both elected and appointed political leadership from within all the fire agencies and organizations.
Got it. I would imagine there's a fair amount of question over, like, is WFLC like NWCG or some of the groups that exist at Interagency Fire Center? And the answer is no. It's a group that's convened to be thought leaders and to be policy leaders and whatnot. And Bob, you were, as Mike said, you were on WFLC for a while, and so I wonder what your perspective on WIFLIC is. And I think it might be interesting to hear what would somebody like in a local government, like you come from Ventura County, what would somebody from local government see as an effect of what's going on with WIFLIC?
Okay. Well, I sat on WIFLIC as the chair of the I-Chiefs Wildland Fire Policy Committee. And so I sat as probably the only local government fire representative on WIFLIC. It was my role is to espouse what does that mean? How's local government interact with state government and the federal partners? As far as WIFLIC goes, it was always the question is what is the authority of WIFLIC? Is WIFLIC, if we all agree on something, does it become law? And it became quite evident early on that WIFLIC is I guess the right term might be is an advisory body. We try to build things through consensus, but because we are not a federal entity, we have no authority as WIFLIC to tell the U.S. Forest Service to go this direction, the Department of Interior to go that direction. Likewise, even the federal agencies couldn't tell each other what to do. So it was always kind of a dance on how do we interact? How do we try to sell something? And Mike, as he came on as the executive coordinator, director of it, he was masterful at trying to craft the message. But even we found out is every 4 years, if a party changed and appointees changed in the country, as the deputy undersecretaries who chaired WIFLIC, so did the direction of WIFLIC kind of meander or go into the doldrums. It varied all the time. So WIFLIC was always kind of a moving target, but it was the best thing we had in the country to pull together the state, local, and national perspectives together in one room under one agenda.
Got it. And I know this is sort of leading, Bob, but Mike had talked about one product of WIFLIC, which was a concrete example of the discussion around fire year. Um, in earlier years, would you say that this thing we talked about a lot on these calls, the cohesive strategy, is that something that's been an offshoot, or at least something that was processed by and through WIFLIC?
Yeah, I would say it was probably more of what I would call an ad hoc group that we've we sensed beginning around 2005, going to 2007, a lot of frustrations at the federal, state, and local level. Sometimes one way, sometimes all different directions between the three parties. It got to such a point that there was an ad hoc group of us who informally we referred to ourselves as the Emmitsburg 13 because we met in Emmitsburg at the National Fire Academy and we talked about what are the things that are tearing our country apart in the wildfire community and how could we come up with something that would make it different. And so you want me to keep going on how it came about, Eric?
Give us a primer, just a quick primer, because we talked
Okay.
about cohesive strategy a lot. Like that's something we're really starting to embrace. So you were part of the creation, and then we're going to Katie, who, I mean, she's carried this for many years, but give us a primer, Bob.
Okay. So the thing was is that we realized that a lot of the federal documents that were being discussed, the National Fire Plan, we talked about the QFFR, the QFR, and all the other alphabets out there, they were all federal centric direction. They did not necessarily involve state and locals. So the creation of the cohesive strategy, the Emmitsburg 13, was trying to figure out how do we merge the three levels of government together toward the common good.
I think a couple things. So QFR, quadrennial fire review, I think it was. It was every 5 years, sort of what's the state of affairs in fire. But it's important to note Emmitsburg's where this was assembled, and so many people who probably watch this, who are based from local government, recognize Emmitsburg because it's the National Fire Academy. Like this is something that's been conceptualized with local response in mind from really day one. But I don't think if you probably get into local government folks and say, I mean, honestly, if you ask them what WIFLIC is, people will, blink and look, probably stare at you confusingly. Same thing with cohesive strategy. And you say, what's cohesive strategy? They might not know exactly what it is, but I think they probably know products of it, right? But it stemmed, you guys met in Emmitsburg. It's an NFA thing. So anyway, I'll stop talking. Katie, let's hear a bit from you, a perspective on WIFLIC and cohesive strategy, because you, as one of the regional folks, you've been sort of carrying implementation for quite a while now. What do you think of this whole shebang?
The shebang. What I always fall back on when I'm talking about WIFLIC to folks who don't really know that it exists is its uniqueness. There is no other forum in the nation where our nation's top leadership from all the agencies, organizations, and other entities that and tribes, there is no other forum where they come together around wildland fire. And so that makes it really unique. And it gives us a lot of opportunity, or has given us a lot of opportunity, to think about, well, what's the power of WIFLIC, and where do those relationships play out? And as Mike described really well, far better than I, thanks for asking him to do that and not me. But that's where I land with WIFLIC, is it really has opportunities to investigate, to do some deep dives, to find out the current status, what's different from 10 years ago, and what's happening out on the landscape of America in terms of wildland fire, what's changing. And so we always, at the WIFLIC level, we've always had a list of priorities, and Mike will probably be better at telling you what those are, but there's always 11 or 12 or 13 or 14 priorities for that group. And that does change a little bit by administration, but in general, they're the same. We're talking about the same wildland fire that's been on the landscape for hundreds of years, but now it's encountering, when it gets there, it's encountering different issues. And so those are growing and changing. And WIFLIC gave us an opportunity, and I don't know about the future of that. I'm sure you're going to speak to that, Mike, but it gives us an opportunity to continue to not only lead in that thought, but how can we think differently about the things that we're seeing looking ahead? I mean, every single person around that table is leading an organization in some way. And so what shifts can be taken by local government or by state government, or even at the national level, the Forest Service or DOI, Office of Wildland Fire? What shifts can be made along the way that get us a little closer to better fire outcomes for all of the people who have a stake in those outcomes? And as Mike described, the really cool thing is that as some of those things changed over the years, it was evident that you can't talk about wildland fire anymore without talking about public health. And so WIFLIC was nimble enough and responsive enough to be able to say, who should we bring, who's the national leads in these areas? And so WIFLIC was able to add CDC and EPA. And that to me says that the opportunities are still there, and wildland fire is not something that we're going to see go away in our lifetime, but how we're responding to it. And even if how many Mikes, 24 members now, 24 members don't have to come together and say, we are all going to do this, this, and this. They can still embrace the idea that we're trying to live better with wildland fire. And what that looks like in every single entity is a little bit different for everybody. But that's what makes WIFLIC unique. And that's where I always land when people talk about WIFLIC and want to know more. Is it's a very unique organization, and we've been lucky to enjoy it for the last, how many years? Since 2002.
Yeah. A lot of us feel lucky that we've been able to enjoy it and that we've had you all on board to carry this. So Katie, specifically, while you're working with Mike on the national level, you were really focused for a long time, primarily on the West. What was the regional thing that developed, and specifically, what were you trying to accomplish in the West?
Well, there was three regions, Southeast, Northeast, and the Western region. And we all have between, I don't know, 17 and 21 states that we looked after. And our charge was to bring the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy to the masses. And I don't know if you want to get into exactly what it is, but I think it's still valid without a doubt. But the idea was to say, okay, if we have if you look at the makeup of WIFLC, we have those same structures even in our region. And so each of us had a committee where members could come and go, but we originally started out with, hey, let's try to mimic what's sitting around the table leadership wise in the region that's sitting around the table at the WIFLC level. And with the idea that our job is to facilitate implementation of the cohesive strategy. So what that looks like, just like priorities are going to mean something a little different to everyone at the WIFLC table, what does that look like to Oregon Department of Forestry or Washington DNR or in New Mexico? And you have a much longer acronym than just DNR, NMERD, I think, in New Mexico. But what does that look like in those different organizations? What does it look like to tribal organizations where every single one is different and their relationship to fire is different? And over the course of the last 12 years, we in the Western region, our philosophy of that facilitation is we need to meet people where they are. If we're going to talk about cohesive strategy and help them understand their role within the cohesive strategy and what it can mean for them, and then describe and help implement some of that strategy in their own work, it looks different everywhere you go and everybody that you come in contact with. So local fire departments implementing cohesive strategy looks a little different than what your state fire agency might, but also some of those what we really chased was not the usual suspects, but who are the other players? And so it's really important to us in the West that we include tribes, and not just one tribe, not a token, but it's very important to us to get a full picture of what fire means in a particular footprint. And that footprint can be the whole state of California, or it could be a certain part of Kansas. And fire means something different in Kansas than it does along the three Western states. When you have fire there, typically it's unwanted. But when you're talking about prescribed fire and putting fire on the landscape and landscapes that need fire, whether it's been occurring or not, each state and sometimes even smaller areas within those states are affected by fire differently. So our job in the Western region, I had a great leadership team. I had 6 people that provided guidance and thought about what we should do each year. And so we were very strategic in, okay, where do we go next? We've been in these places. Where do we go? And how can we help other folks? And part of that is just meeting people where they are.
Awesome. Thank you for that
Mhm.
exploration. It helps. Mike, Katie pointed to you for a couple things, so I'm going to go back to you for a
On
second.
purpose.
First one was that she had said maybe you'd talk about what WIFLC priorities have been, because there's a number of questions coming in. We'll get to those. I think these priorities might actually answer some of these questions, or at least lead to us talking about them. So what have been the WIFLC priorities? What might remain the WIFLC priorities?
Yeah, I'll hit on a few of them. Like Katie said, we kind of maintained a list of about 11 to 12, and those would change a little bit, at least how we talked about them at a high level within administrations. And Bob pointed that out. It has been, I've been through 4 administration changes, and part of the first year of any new administration is letting them know that there's something there. There's a group together working on wildfire, and they're there to support some of these broader discussions and policies and approaches, et cetera. But words matter. Words matter a lot to new administrations, especially in the first year. So we would kind of take some of those issues and test them with the new administration and see if how we were talking about them resonated. So I'll list, 5 or so, but active management, obviously in the first Trump administration, that was an important issue and topic, and how you can use active management to reduce fuels and to reduce risk on the landscape is one. I'll say,
describe active management in one sentence.
I don't know, I'm a forester. We talk about it all the time. Active management is just simply removing fuels across the landscape so that there's less to burn and less threat. Trying to bring it back to more of a ecologically significant fire ecosystem that most of our ecosystems are. So another would be around extreme weather. You can't necessarily manage extreme weather and everything that's changing out there, but understanding that and being thoughtful as to areas that are changing due to extreme weather events and changing climate. Obviously, that one has, there's some politicization of it, if that's the right word, whatever I'm trying to say there. So how that was approached, say, in the Biden administration is very different than how it is being approached and was approached in the first Trump administration. But to me, this is just Mike Zupko here, the things that you need to look at, what's changing out there from a larger macro scale are things that are going to change regardless of what you call them. So, being thoughtful in what you need to do to try to catch up to, if not eventually get ahead of that, is important. I know we've had a couple questions come in around smoke management, air quality, and public health. Katie mentioned that. We've all mentioned that a little bit, but smoke management and air quality has been a priority that the need and the approaches for that haven't changed much. EPA and CDC have different approaches, EPA being a regulatory body that we hadn't really dealt with much before, other than the influences, impacts of some of the regulations, has become an incredible partner. They very much support the use of prescribed fire. They very much understand how a little bit of smoke now will reduce a lot of smoke later when done right. And they very much understand that prescribed burning means you are putting a prescription to where you're trying to get that smoke up and out. So the impact of it is minimalized, as opposed to in a wildfire setting, you don't have any, not that you have control where the smoke goes, but you've at least been thoughtful in a prescribed fire as to what weather patterns are going to look like, winds, et cetera, and what's downwind. So smoke management and air quality has been one that we landed probably 6-7 years ago, with some joint messaging between EPA, CDC, and the WFLC members. And that was before they were a member of WFLC. And they came to us and said, hey, this is an important issue. We want to be at the table. So we've worked on that, like I said, for 3 or 4 years until we brought them to the table officially last year. Another big one, mitigating post-fire impacts. This is one that obviously, any of these really are how they play out in any given fire year. But this is one, looking back even to the National Fire Plan, was of importance, but it didn't necessarily get as much traction back then as it may have recently. And I'd say we know the post-fire impacts are huge. The more catastrophic and more intense fires are, the more issues you're going to have, especially in landscapes that have any type of elevation to them. But there's still some challenges with simple things. I say simple, as simple as transferring a fire from an incident management team back to the community or the local jurisdiction, to where now they kind of have had all that going on with incident management teams propping them up. And now you have, you don't have the same level of structure or support when you talk about bear teams. Bear teams do some great work, but they're there to kind of look at the science of it. You don't have the whole infrastructure behind them to support the community. So that's one area that's been flagged for a while, as to how can we make that post-fire incident management more robust. And then the last one I'll mention is just around community risk reduction, fire adapted communities. It's one of the goals of the cohesive strategy. There's been a whole lot of increase in this space in the last 10 years. And I would attribute a lot of that to, say, Katie, and work that have been done in the regions in identifying communities to say, hey, you may not have a fire at your back door now, but unfortunately it's probably coming, and you need to start doing something now, not after the fact. So the whole community resilience, built environment, fire adapted communities, whatever you want to call it, has definitely greatly increased through the years, but always been identified as a challenge. And now with urban wildfires, urban conflagrations, whatever you want to call them, that's heightened it even more. So so I won't go through all 11, but that's 4 or 5 right there that have had some consistency through the decade or so.
That's perfect, Mike. So from that, this is not just to you, Mike. This is to anyone. Kevin, man, if you could throw in a guest to this if you want, because some of these are so difficult. But looking at the questions, one of them is, what are the most pressing gaps in post-fire recovery planning, such as health, risk mapping, insurance, that kind of stuff? And how can WIFLIC or anybody close those gaps? Anybody have an opinion on that? That's tough.
There's a lot of that question alone has about 7 or 8 different spaces we could go into. I know, and I'm looking at Bob, so I'm gonna pop some of it to you, Bob. But an insurance question. I know Western Fire Chiefs and California has really been looking into that and built some unique partnerships. I think, whereas we've talked about WIFLIC as being a great structure of government to government, there's a lot of components both within government and outside of government, like other associations, the Institute for Building and Home Safety, IBHS, NFPA, et cetera, that have some expertise in this space, and being able to pull them into these conversations, I think, is important. So I know, Bob, you've facilitated some of those relationships. I'd love to hear your thoughts on at least the insurance question and the impact that that's having to driving both before a fire and after a fire.
Okay, so I would offer this as for all the listeners to this, you have to really understand the value of WIFLIC is it brings different parties together. While they may not have the authority to give directions to each other, they begins to make a network of players where dialogue can be had at the meetings, and they can be assigned or ask people to take those on. Likewise, for the insurance issue, as this was brought forward, we knew that the insurance issue was not going to be germane just to California, that it was going to have far-reaching effects. So along the way, we did involve the IBHS, the Institute for Business and Home Safety, as well as we started reaching out to the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. And we started bringing out to the different insurance company, the different trade groups that are out there. As we did this, we found it's like an onion. You start peeling the onion and you get to the different layers that are out there, to the point where we are today. We're no longer just talking to insurance agents. Now we're talking to the actuarial groups that we're being able to begin to understand, how do they set rates? What data sets do they use to be able to see what actions can we do that will affect those data sets, that will at least acknowledge what we're trying to get done is beneficial. So the value of WIFLIC has always been is bringing in the diverse sets of voices into the one umbrella to be able to, now we know who we can talk to among that group, or at least be pointed to take on the next challenge.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to frame it, Bob. It is, it's one place that we're convening influential and at times authoritative bodies, but mostly influential and smart people to come together on solutions. Might not be the only one, and maybe an answer to a question like what was asked about fire recovery planning is maybe there's a space to create something similar, or leverage what exists at WIFLIC to start to talk about filling the gaps around fire recovery planning. Or the second question that we see, I don't know if you guys can see it or not, but it's talking about similarly, how do we start to address the smoke impacts to communities? I know, Mike, you talked about smoke management being a priority, but like how can we start to figure out how to impact or how to reduce the impacts of smoke on our communities, and some sort of balance between prescribed fire benefits?
Yeah,
is it the convening piece the important part?
I think it is, but also the relationship that, say, CDC and EPA have down to state and local public health officials. I think there's a real responsibility there within state and local government to do that, because that is where they have more boots on the ground. Although I would say the more rural the community, the less boots you have on the ground in that public health area. I mean, that's with anything, right? They have more bare bones. One thing, though, before we leave the post fire, one thing I did want to mention, and it goes back to kind of the network that is WIFLIC. Western Governors is one of the members that sits on WIFLIC. Governor Little from Idaho is that representative. But at their summer meeting, they had a panel on post fire. And one of the things that's coming out of that is the charge, I guess, that the governors that were in the room put to Western Governor's staff to create some type of Western post-fire state level coordination group to where they can share not just best practices, but share resources more efficiently, et cetera, within the post-fire space. So we've been having some similar conversations within WIFLIC. Wasn't quite able to get the structure that we had kind of envisioned there, but WIFLIC, WGA took the horns and said, go forth and do this. So I know WGA is working on that. So that's kind of an exciting piece in the post-fire space. So just wanted to get that out there. Back to the smoke, and Katie can probably talk a little bit about it too, because there's some cool stuff going on, say, in Oregon. But yes, the forum and the awareness, but also the understanding of a lot of this is somewhat personal responsibility and understanding what you can do to take care of yourself. And I think that's a piece of the public health where that shifted a little bit. Like there's some things you can do for very little expense to help your house keep smoke out when there's smoke in the air. And it's being able to get troops to be able to help explain that to individuals, to the general public, and or having some things like fans and just regular air filters, for example, to go pick up at your local gym. There's not a lot of cost involved in that. You don't have to have, I mean, yes, HEPA filters are great if you can get one, but there's a cost for that. If you have some simple things to build your own, some of the research and science show you can do that. You just need to understand what to do. So I don't know, Katie, you could probably expand upon that a little bit with some of the stuff locally.
Well, I'll just add on to something that you mentioned, Mike, which I think is super key for us to realize is with all of these issues in communities, it's often and has been for years and decades, individuals are pointing the fingers, what are you doing for me? What are you doing for me? And so that personal responsibility is a large piece of the cohesive strategy. Everybody has a role in the cohesive strategy. And your role as an individual living in a place that's impacted by fire and smoke is to find out what those impacts are and do what you can to mitigate that risk. And there's a lot of things, I don't know how deep in the weeds you want to go, but there's a lot of things that can be done. And across the nation, the last, I don't know, when's the first time we heard about smoke-ready communities? Was it as far back as maybe 10 years ago? Championed by the Forest Service and some of the researchers there that are involved in smoke, but definitely EPA and CDC. And what that is a communications attempt at helping people understand what their risk is in communities, but also what they can do to mitigate that risk. And sometimes, like you said, there's a cost associated with that. And so grants are being made available by counties to provide N95 masks or DIY fan parts, and different groups that maybe aren't as organized as a county, especially in rural areas, but other groups have taken on that role as well. So there's just, I always have a cohesive strategy lens through which I look at everything. And so, when you talk about smoke, I always want to say, well, don't forget, we all have a responsibility here too. But smoke-ready communities was a big effort that has come out of the last 10 years of research. And I think as more communities start to adopt that idea of smoke-ready communities, there is a national program, but there's also a lot of interest in local communities adopting that type of readiness program.
So when we're talking about smoke management or management of the impacts of smoke, it seems like there's sort of two things you all are saying. One is figuring out a way, likely through prescribed fire or maybe management of fire intensity, whatever it is, to put fire on the landscape in a way that's causing less problematic smoke. That's category one.
Mm-hmm.
And then category two is preparing people in communities to manage the impacts that it has on them. in whatever way that is, whether it's through some sort of community action or whether it's individual action. Is that right?
Yeah, it's how are you going to receive that smoke? Just like we talk about how are you going to receive fire? What's fire going to see when it gets there? What's smoke going to do when it gets there? And so is that a situation that just involves your home, or does it involve our public schools? Does it involve libraries? Does it involve large Red Cross directed smoke respite centers? Um, there's something at scale for whatever the problem is. But we always talk about communities in particular, and those aren't necessarily just neighborhoods. They could also be communities of interest, like sectors, healthcare sectors, and utilities sectors. And what are smoke and fire going to find when it arrives? And yes, we're going to do our best, and we're pretty dang good at prescribed fire across the country, but sometimes that goes sideways for a variety of reasons. But whatever it is, you end up with a smoke issue, sometimes a fire issue, and that takes some thought ahead of time. What are you going to do if you have an asthmatic kid? What are you going to do if your grandma lives with you and she's asthmatic, or worse? What are you going to do? My mother-in-law had lung cancer, and where she lived, there was multiple fires up in Eastern Oregon that were impacting where she lived. And so your range of responsibility and the scale to which you approach that is going to be different for everybody, but including that opportunity in just thinking about the topic itself is necessary.
Yeah, and Eric, I'll even say the intersect between the two things you just said is key to it. And I guess this is, again, part of my forestry background, but I'm not putting blame on humans. However, before there were humans, or before there was the public, the landscape just had fire go through it. One of the best stories here in the Southeast was a gentleman who's long since passed, but he was registered forester number 2. And he used to talk about driving from South Georgia, Uncle Harley was his name, to the University of Georgia before the interstate system. So we're talking in the 50s. And he would say, if I'd go more than about 15 minutes to where I didn't see a low creeping fire underneath the pine woods, I was concerned, because that meant the next time I'm driving home, a month or two later, that fire might be bigger because there's more brush. So that said, that was a little bit of smoke. It was just kind of creeping along, skunking along, whatever. Take that now to where we have large populations, which we're going to have, but they're built in areas that used to burn, and they used to be smaller pocket burns. I mean, not that there weren't some larger burns, but it's now the intersect of humans with what used to be wildlands, right? You can also throw into that, and we haven't talked about it, but the indigenous knowledge and the tribal knowledge of these things. There's still many tribes that know how to manage both the fire and the smoke. And they will also tell us that there are landscapes that need smoke. Smoke is cooling on certain rivers at certain times of the year that help the fish populations. There's certain bark that needs some level of smoke in it at certain times of the year because it helps it do some fancy word I can't understand that's got a bunch of ology at the end of it. But there's components there that we as humans kind of took out of the system, and now we're trying to figure out how to manage the complexity of it while we continue to put people and we all live in these places, but while we continue to want to live in beautiful places without having fire where there used to be fire here before it had humans. So I took us pretty deep, pretty fast. Katie wants to say something. I can tell.
I do. You can tell. I know I'm trying not to jump all over you, but I think about what we're experiencing on a more common level lately is those urban fires. And we think about prescribed fire, and you're burning natural vegetation, which is putting up, yes, smoke, and yes, not good smoke. There's no smoke that's actually good for you. But when we're talking about the urban environment, and we're talking about the toxins that are in people's homes, and what do you do with all of that? So not only is it putting up some really bad, cancerous, horrible smoke, but then all the debris that's left over, what are you doing with that? So the problems that we're encountering on a more regular basis now involve that urban setting that are causing us to come back together and rethink, okay, what is the state of the wildland fire system that we're in, because it's not just when smoke is in the air, it's afterwards, and it speaks to recovery. Where in California, we keep reading where people are putting some of that debris from the Eaton fire into dumps. They're traveling 10 hours and dropping that stuff off at local city municipal landfills. And what's that doing? So I think the benefit, to circle back to your original conversation around WIFLIC, and the benefit of these leadership opportunities that we have, is that we can now address some of those other issues. Are we going to solve them? I don't know, but it gives us an opportunity as leaders across the entire nation to say, okay, this could be effectively an even bigger problem, an outcome of this wildland fire. And so us working together collaboratively across boundaries, all in the name of cohesive strategy and everything that it stands for, that's the opportunity we have with WIFLIC and with the regions, is to now we're talking about something different that's equally as nightmarish as just a fire.
Yeah, I'm going to use what you just said about across borders and boundaries to ask a question that did come in. And we'll speaking of circle back, we're going to circle back to Palisades and Eaton in a second as we start to get into current legislation and things that are in our near future. So coming back to that in a second, but a question came in about Canada, and
Mhm.
I think this year, like last year and probably the past, a lot of how we talked about Canadian fires was the smoke impacts it had on the U.S., which it probably isn't the appropriate way to look at it, but that's sort of how we see it in the news. And I'd imagine up in Canada, we're impacting them plenty with our smoke as well. I don't follow the weather patterns, but I can't see how we wouldn't. Um, can anybody address like Canadian US collaboration? Is it something that should be guided by WIFLIC? Is there a better place for that collaboration to happen? What are your thoughts on that?
I
Anyone?
have a I have a symptom that we're noticing now that Canada is starting to see these gigantic million-acre fires, and they are looking to the United States for, what do we do with these? What leadership do we put in place to deal with these very remote, very, very large timber-driven fires that are happening up in the northern territories? I don't think that's right. But so when you say, is there, and Chief Roper, I think we spoke about this years ago. We were saying, Canada doesn't have a WIFLIC type organization where just some of that high level conversation can occur, and there can be some recognition of what's coming down the pike in this world of wildland fire. And so we've had this conversation where we thought, well, what if we offered that and formed some sort of cross boundary leadership team? And there are some from the different provinces, but there's never been a Canadian national type leadership organization like we have here. So I think it would be kind of cool.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Katie, you're right. You're right in that each of the provinces have their own fire organizations.
Mm.
And Canada is just now having that entry dialogue about trying to form one national fire organization. What does that mean? We don't really know. But now that they're talking, we are seeing more dialogue about even response compacts, how we can facilitate those to send resources north quicker and so forth. And in an odd way, we have to say that the smoke coming into the US has actually helped our country entertain the dialogue about what does smoke do? What are the pluses and minuses of it? Because for a lot of people in, say, New York, they didn't have any smoke issues. They may hear about the smoke from California going into Nevada, but it's light years away from them. This brings the whole topic home on the issue of fire and the health effects of the smoke. So, in a roundabout, odd way, it's been beneficial to our whole dialogue.
Yeah, interesting. You use that example, Bob, because it was June 6th of 2023, which was my birthday. But Katie and I and a handful of others were in DC at some hearings on the cohesive strategy addendum. So we did an update to the cohesive strategy that rolled out in 2014. We had done a 5-year, and then we did the addendum, and we were testifying, and it was a couple of days in DC to where we could say, that smoke that you came through, to get to your house building today, that's coming from Canada, but that's indicative of what's going on out west, what's going on in different places. New Jersey's had, or some Northeast states have had some pretty larger fires that have been hit some city centers and all, and be able to use that as an unfortunate but leverage tool to help folks who typically on the East Coast don't see a lot of that, understand what that's like, and the need for it. One thing I'll mention back with the Canadian coordination, they have had their interagency, Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Center as part of it on the kind of operations and suppression side. And some of the compacts in the Northeast have been pretty effective in sharing resources. But I think part of that question, Eric, you were framing was more about collective land management, understanding the landscape. One area we haven't touched on at all, and I'm looking at the time, and not that we can do this in even 5 minutes, but the whole arena where technology and information and generative AI and all that plays, I think is important and is being noticed. The trick is it can't necessarily be every new shiny object has the answer, because different systems tell different stories, and how that all plays and the coordination of that, I think, is important. And I think on a different podcast, y'all explored some of that a little bit, some of the technology pieces. But I just flagged that to say there's a high recognition as we talk to others in North America, even on the southern border with Mexico and some of the drier landscapes down there, being able to use some modeling, being able to use some of that technology, and then being able to be thoughtful in how those policies may fit together to help address this broader issue that does impact all of North America.
Thanks, Mike. And I love good segues. You just gave a good segue. I totally am with you that we could cover this for 5 minutes or an hour. And honestly, a lot of what Bob has been doing with Western Fire Chiefs Association over the last couple of years has been in this tech space. But the segue is different than that, and that is in the executive order that a lot of people think is essentially about consolidating the wildland workforces at the federal level, which that's a key component of the executive order. But the executive order is called Empowering Common Sense Wildfire Prevention and Response. A part of that is developing a tech roadmap. And so I'm curious, you got 3 different opinions here, maybe it's the same, but what are the thoughts on the executive order? What should we expect out of it? And Mike, this does not have to start with you. It's an open question to anybody. This executive order about consolidation and other things, what should we expect out of that?
I'm pointing at Mike. He runs this committee.
I'll start.
Well, we've had a work group that's been really active for the last couple of years, so that's why I want you to dive in on that, Mike.
Yeah, no. We've got a couple things we can talk about here. One, Katie's referencing a science, data, technology work group within Wildland Fire Leadership Council. We hosted a workshop last summer, basically consolidated 10 previous reports into 250 some odd or 240 some odd recommendations, and then went through a prioritization process. So I think there's definitely a lot of good fodder within what WFLIC has worked through in that piece. To kind of take that back, Eric, to your question around the executive order, a couple of unique things. One, today is September 10th, or at least we're recording this on September 10th. My understanding is USDA and DOI, we're going to start to roll out their, I'll call it an implementation guide. I've not heard that term, but that's what I'll call it. How that broader executive order will be implemented going forward. It had some pretty strict deadlines in there, 90-day, 180-day, et cetera. I think the realization was there's no way in heck that those things were going to get done in that amount of time, but at least defining what that looks like. To that technology roadmap, I'm interested to see, and I don't know, I've not been a part of any of the what I'll call is a somewhat internal process to the development of the implementation of this EO, but the technology roadmap in particular can't be done in a federal bubble. It's got to be done with state, local, tribal partners. It's got to be done with the technologists or the companies that have the knowledge and information. And it's got to be done with other federal partners like Department of Defense that have a lot in this space that we can learn from. So again, I have no clue what that technology roadmap is going to look like. There's a lot of great minds in this space that have a lot of great information and have been espousing it for the past couple of years. So I just hope that as that roadmap rolls out, that's a piece of it. To some of the other broader pieces in the executive order, like the consolidation, I think we definitely know Congress is not interested in that right now, or at least Congress is not interested in consolidating DOI and USDA fire programs into one unless they understand what that's going to look like. And nobody has been able to put down a clear picture of what that looks like without there being a lot of, I'll even say, infighting. So interested to see, how that plays out. And I think leadership at the federal level, but leadership among all levels of government are going to have to use their strong voices to help define what that needs to look like. I think we could all agree that can changes help improve the systems that are there? Heck yeah. Do we need to blow up the system to do that? Mike Zupko doesn't necessarily think so, but maybe we can learn some things by, as Bob referenced before, kind of peeling back pieces of the onion and seeing how far you have to go.
We know it gets real when Mike Zupko refers to himself in the third person. That's when he's serious.
It's getting late in the day here in the South.
Bob or Katie, any opinions on that EO consolidation? Anything you want to
You
add?
go.
Okay. So the one thing I would say is all of us need to realize that this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to at least engage in the dialogue about the national wildland fire problem. The consolidation is just one part of it. The road map for technology is the other part. But we have to ask ourselves, is this a plan? The EO can only direct things at the federal level, but it also talks about state and locals being part of it. So the big question is, the consolidation deals with the federal entities, but what about the state and locals? If we improve the federal response capability, how do we improve the state and local? A lot of the dialogue that's being done right now is all at the federal level. We're still waiting for the next phase after today's release of the implementation guide on what the locals and states will participate in. That, I think, is the all-time important thing for our future. The technology roadmap is highly important because it's going to involve a lot more science and technology, which will give us some of the greatest yields in immediate metrics that we'll be able to use for decision support. But again, as we all know, when a fire happens, the policymakers, they would like to see more fire trucks, more aircraft in the skies. So it's a dance we do, and we've been doing it for a long time, and we hope that this is not a missed opportunity.
Katie?
Oh, I think Chief Roper nailed it.
Yeah.
I would just add that I'm glad there's a focus on technology. We can't ignore what's happening and what's changing, and to acknowledge that in the EO, I think is a good thing. And what that looks like on the other side keeps changing because we're talking about technology, which is improving every day, not just how we detect fire, but how can we use AI to determine where that fire is going to go. And does our future include things like you don't have humans on the fire line anymore? You have really cool robots, that through AI and that can't be burned. I can't even imagine what those might cost, but I'm just thinking, what does that future look like 50 years out? And how are we positioning ourselves to be open to some technology that helps all of us in this national wildland fire problem?
Thanks. So we've got just a minute or two left. So I want to bring up one last piece of legislation, the FOFA, Fixed Our Forests Acts, and wonder if any of you have an opinion on what's happening with that and what's the promise of FOFA, because it gets a lot of attention.
Bob, you want to go first?
Sure. You know, the Fix Our Forests Act is the core component there is the National Intelligence Center for Wildfire. And I think this is paramount, um, and for a lot of reasons why it's desperately needed. The other components, whether it's timber production and so forth, a lot of this is a moving target as it went from the House to the Senate back to the House. We're still waiting for some final compromise language and so forth. But again, focused around the National Intelligence Center and what that will yield will be paramount to our success.
Mike or Katie, any FOFA opinions?
Yeah, I'll just add that, another piece of it, and Bob referenced it, is somewhat trying to streamline the ability to get work done on the ground when it comes to biomass or harvest removal, however you want to look at it, but debris, et cetera. So I think there's an opportunity there. I know that's a little bit more controversial within some circles, saying, where do you set those limits? How much do you open up environmental regulations, et cetera? But I think the reality is we know that there's a whole lot of material, a whole lot of biomass out there, whether that's standing trees or on the ground, and it takes in some places a while to get that removed. There's also some community risk reduction components of it, which I think are good, kind of some different programs that could be elevated there. Just kind of speaking, in addition to FOFA, the unique space that we're in right now is Congress is heavily engaged in a lot of these conversations. I want to say there's probably close to 200, maybe more than that now, pieces of legislation that are wildfire specific. In the past, it's always been, and we'll add wildfire to this other piece of legislation like Farm Bill or something else. Now we have very specific legislation that's being driven by a lot of different and new interest groups. There's a lot of new wildfire interest groups in the space in the last 5 years, which could be another complete podcast at some point in time, Eric. And how we all interact in the space is pretty exciting right now with all the interest. So, but I think FOFA has probably the best chance, and as Bob mentioned, some really solid components in it.
Nice. Katie, anything to put icing on the cake?
No, we're out of time.
That was pretty good. They did well. Thank you. Bob, Mike, Katie, I'm going to close and throw it to Kevin. I'm just going to say one thing, a comment that came in, and then a comment of mine. Comment that came in is in Canada, we're moving towards the National Fire Administration for exactly what Katie said. So, Katie, you've contributed to Canadian success. Good job. They're going to have an administration and administrator soon. And for me, I just want to say again, I said at the beginning, only partly joking, that you three can actually make policy exciting. Wealth of knowledge, and I learn something every time I listen to the three of you. So thanks. Kevin, it's to you.
I only have like 100 follow-on questions, but that conversation went like a wildfire. So Bob, Mike, Kate, I'm definitely going to continue to follow up, and we want to spotlight the important work that you're leading, and definitely interested in how we can translate that to community risk reduction, translate that to entrepreneurs that are trying to get involved and figure out. So more to follow on that, but just want to say thank you for the conversations. Everyone continue to kind of stay tuned for the IFC YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn for our bi-weekly Tech Talk Tuesday, bi-weekly Wildfire Wednesdays, and reach out to me, ksofen@ifc.org. If you want to connect with any speakers, they're all on LinkedIn as well. So just want to thank you all for participating today. Bob, Mike, Kate, thank you. Eric, as always, appreciate it, and hope you all have a great rest of your day.